Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 124. Today, we're going to wrap up our mini-series on the Malacostracans and our exploration of the decapods by looking at one of their most derived groups, the infraorder Brachyura, or the true crabs. We'll cover some of the evolutionary history of the crabs, as well as that whole carcinization phenomenon, and of course, we'll touch on everything you'd ever wanted to know about their physiology, life cycle, behavior, and ecology. Now, the crabs are widespread, well-known, and charismatic. Their classic body form stands out from the rest of the animals that we usually see on land and in the sea. From a scientific perspective, they're remarkably fascinating animals with a unique weirdness in form and function, and a valuable ecological position as both predator and prey. And with all that being said, let's wind back the clock and begin our episode with the evolutionary history of the crabs. The ancestral crustaceans were among the earliest animal groups to emerge during the Ediacaran, around 570 to 550 million years ago. These ancestral crustaceans had descended from simple worm-like creatures with shelled, segmented, multi-legged bodies, a suite of traits that was passed down to all of their arthropod descendants. Approximately 500 million years ago, well after the Cambrian explosion had tapered off, the crustaceans had diverged into a variety of different groups. Among them were the ancestral Malacostracans. Various Malacostracan descendant groups branched off, like the copepods and the isopods, the krill, and most relevant for today's episode, the decapods, a lineage that emerged sometime in the Ordovician, likely around 475 million years ago. Within this decapod lineage, there was an early pulse of diversification around 450 million years ago, producing the ancestors of the prawns and the true shrimps of Caridia. And around 400 million years ago, the ancestors of the lobsters and the crayfish diverged from the remaining decapod stem group. This decapod stem group would of course continue to diverge, producing various offshoot lineages like mud shrimps and then hermit crabs, and by the mid-Carboniferous, roughly 325 million years ago, the ancestral Brachyura emerged, the true crabs. This means that Brachyura is actually the youngest major group of crustaceans. However, it must be stressed that these ancestral true crabs did not look like modern crabs. They still more closely resembled their ancient cousins, like the prawns and the lobsters. They had abdomens that extended back and sometimes curled downward, although these didn't fossilize very well. The carapace, the armor plating on their head and thorax, was more likely to fossilize, but these don't provide a whole lot of information necessary to recreate ancient relationships. It's likely that there were several stem group lineages that emerged in the Carboniferous and Permian periods, but either they weren't particularly successful or they were wiped out in the devastating End-Triassic mass extinction event. A specific cause for that mass extinction hasn't been conclusively determined, but it's widely suspected that thousands of years of volcanic activity led to global warming and ocean acidification. This mass extinction ultimately saw the destruction of almost half to 3/4 of all the species in the Triassic oceans. Many reef communities were destroyed, and populations of decapods crashed. In addition, bivalves, gastropods, and marine reptiles also suffered, with many species going extinct. As reef communities recovered at an accelerating rate over the Jurassic, animals like cephalopods and the crabs recovered as well. As a quick aside, many of the vertebrates that were dominant on land in terrestrial ecosystems throughout the Permian and Triassic, they were wiped out in the End-Triassic extinction, opening up ecological niches for the dinosaurs to adapt into. This would begin the long evolutionary rise of the dinosaurs, who would come to dominate terrestrial ecosystems in the Jurassic and Cretaceous. Anyway, let's dive back into the oceans and check back in with the Brachyurans. Of all the Brachyurans to emerge during the Triassic, only 2 lineages would make it to the dawn of the Jurassic about 200 million years ago, and both of them possessed the sturdy, robust, crab-like body form that had served them well throughout the collapse of the Triassic. But now they faced a recovering ecology, a healing world whose oceans were repopulating, whose reefs were regenerating, and whose ecologies were redeveloping trophic and chemical complexity. The Brachyurans experienced an age of opportunity in the Jurassic. They had developed a hardy and highly capable body form, and now they could compete for the many available ecological niches in the world's recovering ecosystems. They began to radiate and diversify like crazy. The biodiversity of the crabs increased throughout the Jurassic and well into the Cretaceous, and ultimately, 80% of the lineages of modern crabs emerged during this Cretaceous crab revolution. Only 20% of modern crab lineages are descended from groups that emerged in that first 175 million years or so of their existence. Another factor driving their diversification was the evolution and proliferation of shell-crushing predators. This was a development that mostly victimized crinoids, bivalves, gastropods, and other immobile or slow-moving shelled animals. This also affected the crabs, just to a lesser degree, as the crabs were able to more successfully adapt defensive measures like burrowing or escape behaviors, or aggressive defensive behaviors like pinching with their claws. These crabs continued to diversify and proliferate throughout the rest of the Mesozoic, and well into the Cenozoic up until the modern day, where they continue to provide important ecological functions in habitats across the world. Okay, let's take a closer look at the older stem lineages that emerged immediately before Brachyura, and then we'll look at the Brachyurans themselves. Now remember that within the order Decapoda, there were the swimming decapods and the crawling decapods, also known as Reptantia. This Reptantia clade branched into 2 main groups. In the previous episode, we covered one of these groups, one of these lineages that produced the crayfish, the lobsters, and their relatives. And now we're going to explore the other group, the other lineage, the one that produced the true crabs and their relatives. The most basal of these groups are the Axiidea, followed by the Gebiidea, and then the sister group to the Brachyura themselves, the Anomura, or the hermit crabs. Okay, so let's start with those first 2 groups I mentioned. The Axiidea and the Gebiidea are the 2 oldest offshoots, and each includes a small menagerie of strange, sort of shrimp-like creatures. They have a really weird fusion of the caracoid facies body form, typical of shrimp and smaller Malacostracans, but they also have the engorged forelimbs that are so characteristic of the lobsters, the crayfish, and the crabs. For example, the ghost shrimp in the Axiidea family, Callianacidae, include a number of species with narrow, elongated, lobster-like abdomens, replete with a full but miniature tail fin. Other genera, like the Acanthaxius, include species that resemble miniature lobsters. The Gebiidean genus, Thalassina, also includes some remarkable lobster-like animals, despite their unusual and very unlobster-like abdomen, which is long and narrow, and lacking a tail fin. Now, most of the animals in these 2 groups are generally small, with most species being just a single-digit number of centimeters from head to tail. But there are larger species, although they usually don't grow longer than 35 centimeters, give or take, so about a third of a meter. The Axiidea and the Gebiidea are shallow water shrimps. Almost all species live in the intertidal zone, or in the vegetated photic zone in the shallow waters of the continental shelf, usually no deeper than 200 meters or so. The animals in both of these groups are often called mud shrimp because they generally prefer sandy or silty ocean floors, something with a soft substrate that they can really dig into. They can be prolific nest builders, known for constructing large and elaborate burrows in the mud. Some species, of course, just build simple burrows, no more than a narrow tunnel with a single curve or a side chamber. They retreat into these dark, muddy holes to avoid predators, or to rest in safety. Sometimes these burrows are filled with residual plant detritus, which are the discarded remnants of the mud shrimp's diet. By analyzing the type of plant debris in these narrow tunnels, scientists can actually determine the species of mud shrimp that lives or lived there. In any case, the extensive burrowing activity of these mud shrimp has a really important ecological function. They mechanically stir up and cycle the soil, digging up deeper material and depositing it on the seafloor. This is particularly useful in coastal habitats with lots of vegetation, like mangrove forests or swamps, or the mouth of a river feeding into an ocean. The mud shrimp dig into the seafloor and they dredge out organic debris. And as they dig their burrows, this organic muck that's scooped out and thrown aside is stirred into the water column, where it breaks down and creates soluble nutrients that plants can absorb, like minerals and organic carbon. This process is really important for sustaining the health of various coastal and riparian habitats around the world, from mangrove forests to seagrass meadows. Alright, now the next clade that we're going to look at before Brachyura is actually the sister group to the Brachyurans themselves. These are the anomurans. The anomurans are the most closely related to the true crabs genetically, so there's also a fair bit of physiological and morphological similarity too, not to mention ecological overlap. Consider the porcelain crabs, which are one of the most basal anomuran groups. Like their more basal non-brachyuran cousins, they live on the seafloor. But unlike them, they have a much larger range of depths in the ocean that they can comfortably live at. You'll find porcelain crabs in the intertidal zone all the way down to the dark depths where light doesn't touch the ocean floor. And in all of these habitats, at every depth that they live at, these porcelain crabs hide under rocks to avoid predators, where they can safely and quietly eat their food. They also look kind of like squat lobsters, but with shorter, flatter, more crab-like body forms. Although, if you look closely, like at their face, you realize it's quite uncrab-like. Also, where true crabs use their claws for catching prey, warning off predators, and fighting other crabs, the anomuran porcelain crabs use their giant claws merely for territorial disputes, for pushing trespassers out of their little plot of territory. Another detail is the number of visible legs. Like all the decapods, the porcelain crabs have 10 legs, but the last pair has been reduced and tucked under the body. If they have any use at all, they're used to brush or clean the gills and the belly. A more ancestral form of the anomuran can be seen in the Munididae, a similarly basal family related to the porcelain crabs. These are deep-water creatures with freaky, quasi-lobster-like body forms, although the abdomen seems more rounded, the eyes more bulbous, and the face equipped with several forward-facing spines or spikes. The body is compact and rotund, but the foremost legs are the opposite, long, gangly, and narrow, with slender, scissor-like claws. This freakish body form is distinctly unlike a crab, but it can be seen across the Anomura clade. For example, the porcelain crabs have achieved a crab-like body form, but all of their closely related cousins, like the Chirostyloidea, have this more primitive, sort of crab-like, sort of lobster-like, long-armed body shape. There's many unique permutations of this form. Consider, for example, the Chirostylus, a genus of squat lobster that has a massively reduced body, with very long, very narrow legs and arms, to the point that many of its species look like an aquatic version of a daddy-long-legs or a harvestman spider. Here's another great example. There's a related genus called Kaiwa, or Kiwa, which contains yeti lobsters and yeti crabs. This moniker comes from their arms and carapace, which are a snowy white or a stony gray-white color, but they're covered in brown or yellowish spines or bristles that look kind of like fur. Creepy, crusty, aquatic fur. These are deep-water crustaceans, which live on the seafloor near deep-sea hydrothermal vents, where they feed on communities of bacteria. I actually want to take a closer look here, because a very fascinating symbiosis formed here, where some specialized species of sulfur-oxidizing filamentous bacteria inhabit the spines or the bristles on the yeti crab's arms and carapace. These bacteria break down the sulfur-rich compounds exuding from the deep-sea vents, and they temper the chemical toxicity of the immediate environment. There have been many observations of these animals moving back and forth to feed the symbiotic bacteria. The Kiwa puriovita in the deep sea near Costa Rica has been observed waving its arms over hydrothermal vents, directly feeding the bacterial colonies living on and in its tissues. These colonies are then harvested by the yeti crab, using its specialized comb-like mouthparts. The closely related Kiwa tyleri, or the Hoff crab, has its spines and bristles mounted along its underside, its chest and belly. This hairy chest drew comparisons to actor David Hasselhoff, who found the whole thing very funny. More pertinent to the yeti crab's biology, a few parasites, like limpet bivalves in the Lepidodrilidae family, have been observed living on the Kiwa tyleri, eating the bacteria colonies that the yeti crab is cultivating on its belly. Now, not all of the Anomura have this strange, semi-crab-like, semi-lobster-like, very long-armed body form. There's other strange body forms too. The freshwater Agliidae have much reduced abdomens and an oval body shape, almost like a beetle with little claws. The Hippoian superfamily, also known as the sand crabs, are also rounded and oval-shaped, which is effective for digging into the sand and embedding themselves in the substrate, where they filter feed on bacteria and small invertebrates. Another permutation of the anomuran body form, this one uniquely asymmetrical, exists in the hermit crabs. Where many of these crab-adjacent crustaceans exhibit a reduced abdomen, perhaps as a means of reducing body parts available for predators to grab onto, the hermit crab's abdomen is both reduced and uncalcified. It's unarmored. Their abdomen is like a thick tentacle, a long, tapering, soft appendage that coils up off to one side of the body. This creates an asymmetry in the body structure, but other asymmetries exist as well. For example, most hermit crabs possess an overdeveloped right arm, which serves as both a shield and a more powerful melee weapon. It's much larger and stronger, with thicker exoskeletal tissue than the left arm. In a very curious twist of evolutionary tinkering, there's a family of hermit crabs called Diogenidae with over 400 species, known as the left-handed hermit crabs, because instead of their right arm, it's their left arm that's overdeveloped, and their right arm is smaller and weaker, which stands in contrast to pretty much every other hermit crab. The hermit crabs, with some exceptions, do not grow exoskeletal armor over their abdomen. They have soft skin instead of calcified plating. This is actually what they're named for. They're named for their tendency to seek out abandoned mollusk shells, like from sea snails, and then live in them. Their soft, curling abdomen slides in first, fitting snugly into the internal spiraling chamber of the mollusk shell. Should a predator come by, like a hungry bird, the hermit crab can withdraw deeper into the shell, pulling its limbs and eye stalks inside, and perhaps even covering up the opening with its claws to seal itself away. Some additional adaptations to this lifestyle include the repositioning of the limbs. Instead of coming out underneath the body, or more to the sides, the legs protrude forward, where they can best reach out of the opening of the shell. In a way, This is almost like the much more primitive caracoid facies, the shrimp-like body form, where the thoracic legs protrude forward directly under the head. In this somewhat awkward position, the hermit crab can scurry along, revealing its claws to fend off another hermit crab or to discourage a hungry predator. There's an extremely fascinating ecology behind this acquisition and use of mollusk shells. Just consider some of the variables involved here. For any given habitat or locality, there has to be a suitable number of snails of the right size. The hermit crabs will only use shells that are big enough to comfortably house them. After all, if a shell is too big, it'll be too heavy, it'll be cumbersome and difficult to carry, and it may slip off, or it may be easily stolen by a predator or a competing hermit crab. If a shell is too small, it may constrain the growth of the hermit crab, and it won't offer enough protection as it can't fully retract inside. So having the right size shells in a given habitat is really important. Then you have to subtract from this population of snails all of those whose shells are broken and destroyed by predators, or are soiled or made unsuitable by fungus or something like that. The remaining shells of a suitable size are what's available for the hermit crabs. Now consider that in a given habitat, you might have multiple species of snail of various sizes, which means the habitat is littered with small, medium, and large snail shells. Thus, there's enough for multiple species of hermit crab, so long as they too vary in size in proportion to the number of shells. This is generally a stable and sustainable arrangement, but it takes a fair bit of evolutionary jostling to get here. A particularly interesting behavioral phenomenon is seen in the anomurans. They are cooperative, they exhibit cooperation. A somewhat common situation begins with a hermit crab looking for a bigger shell, something it can move into after its next molt. The hermit crab may find a shell, but it's just slightly too big, even after the molt. So instead of just giving up or looking somewhere else, it actually might hang out nearby. It'll hang out near that slightly too big shell until another slightly larger hermit crab comes by and chooses to move into that too big shell. This new hermit crab would leave its old shell behind, and the original hermit crab, the one that was hanging around and waiting by the empty shell, could then use the old one left behind by that new hermit crab as its new home. It's a nice sequence of events that benefits both hermit crabs. Now you might be wondering, what happens if it takes a while before that second hermit crab, the slightly bigger one, wanders by? Well, smaller hermit crabs may also come by and notice what's going on. They'll hang out together in groups of up to 20 individuals or so, arranged by size, all waiting for the big hermit crab to come along and claim that too big shell. When it finally happens, all of the smaller hermit crabs will quickly leave their old shells, move down the line one space to pick up the new slightly bigger shell from their sequentially larger neighbor, and then the entire group disperses. The individuals moving on with their own hermit lives, with their new shells to be worn until their next molt. Now this cooperation is really cool and all, but sometimes the hermit crabs are less agreeable. Brute violence is a common strategy. Hermit crabs of a similar size may both desire a choice shell, and they'll fight each other over it. Both participants can be maimed in this combat, and the loser, usually the smaller one, may even be killed. Scientists have even observed groups of hermit crabs ganging up on a lone individual with a desirable shell, ripping them to pieces and ending their life in agony just for the calcium carbonate on their back. This brutal violence has been going on for theoretically the last 175 to 200 million years, as the hermit crabs have been using snail shells since at least the late Cretaceous, and before that, in the Jurassic, they were using ammonite shells. The hermit crab family, Parapaguridae, is unique in that most of its species have abandoned the stresses of shell hunting and shell competition. They've made a few evolutionary innovations that have rendered such barbaric activities obsolete. Their solution is that they don't use mollusk shells at all. They have something better. The Parapaguridae collect small colonies of cnidarians, like zoanthids, corals, and sea anemones, whose conglomerated mineralized tissues create a hard casing for the hermit crab's abdomen. The cnidarians can provide another layer of defense, as they have stinging cells in their tentacles that can discourage predators. There are other hermit crabs that just don't use shells or bryozoans or anything at all. Instead, they live more like lobsters, scurrying around on the ground under rocks and in the shadows, and hiding in burrows in the sand. These hermit crabs that don't even bother wearing any kind of shell or cnidarian, they're more likely to hide in the tunnels and the nests built by other animals, like worm snails, bristleworms, and corals. As I've described the behavior of the hermit crabs, you might have been visualizing an aquatic environment, like a sandy seafloor or a coral reef. This is, indeed, where many hermit crabs live, but a significant portion of them, mostly in the family Cenobidae, have adapted to a semi-terrestrial lifestyle, where they live on land and breathe air through their gills. But this means they need to keep their gills moist, so they're generally restricted to humid tropical areas, usually near a body of water like the coast. They frequently need to return to water to fill up their shells, carrying a supply of water with them to make sure that they can keep their gills wet. The Cenobidae hermit crabs begin life as aquatic larvae, but soon they mature into hardy adults that can thrive in their tropical, coastal, and intertidal habitats. They've adapted other water conservation strategies too, aside from just carrying water in their shell. Most terrestrial hermit crabs will rest during the day, when it's hot and bright, and they'll come out to hunt or scavenge for food during the night, so they're active when it's dark and cool. This minimizes evaporation through their gills, and it helps them conserve water. Many species also live in swamps and mangrove forests, as these provide a soft, muddy substrate that they can burrow into, and mazes of raised tree roots that provide lots of shelter against larger predators. Having these secluded, sheltered areas is critical for when they need to molt in safety. One of the largest hermit crabs is also one of the most well-adapted for the terrestrial environment. These are the coconut crabs, scientific name Burgus latro. As a juvenile, they use snail shells like any other hermit crab, but after a certain age, they eventually develop armor plating on their abdomen, and they stop using foreign shells for protection. For one thing, there just aren't enough snails big enough to make shells that could fit a mature coconut crab. I should clarify that the coconut crabs are not just one of the largest hermit crabs, they are the largest hermit crab species in the world. Moreover, they're the largest terrestrial arthropod in the world, and the largest terrestrial invertebrate in the world. They can grow to have a meter-long leg span, and their main body structure can be more than a foot long. At these sizes, in their tropical oceanic island habitats, they don't have any natural predators aside from humans. And because they grow such a large body size, many coconut crabs find that molting can be a complicated and drawn-out process. Once a year, the coconut crabs will gorge on food, hoarding calories and fattening up their soft internal tissues, and then they'll dig a large hole in the sand or soil and bury themselves within it. In this protected space, buried in the sand, they'll begin to molt. The process takes a long time, multiple weeks, especially for bigger individuals. They'll take their time, patiently moving bit by bit until they can fully extract themselves from their old exoskeleton. The new exoskeleton takes another 1 to 3 weeks to harden, and the coconut crab will remain hidden in the sand during this vulnerable time. This is why they gorge on food, because they're going to spend like 5 to 6 weeks buried in the sand just getting out of their old exoskeleton and then hardening up their new one and just getting ready to go back out into the world. Now you might be thinking that the coconut crabs have to be predators. After all, they're so huge, they must need a diet rich in protein. And surely they can catch the countless insects and small vertebrates around them on their island habitats. But counterintuitively, they're actually omnivorous scavengers who prefer soft, mealy fruit from coconuts or bananas and various nuts and seeds. As their name suggests, they've been observed husking coconuts and carving a hole through the side of the shell over the course of several days so that they can get to the nutritious, watery flesh inside. But much like the other decapods, they're opportunistic omnivores. If they get a chance to gobble up some smaller animal, like a tiny fish, a small rodent or a lizard, or some big bug, they'll take the opportunity. All of these terrestrial hermit crabs can tolerate water with varying salinities. They're born in seawater, they lay their eggs in seawater, and they can use seawater, brackish water, or fresh water to keep their gills wet. But oddly, there's just a single species of hermit crab that actually lives in fresh water, Clibinarius fonticola, found in a single small pool on the island of Espiritu Santo of the South Pacific nation Vanuatu. As for the mollusk shell that the Clibinarius fonticola uses to protect its abdomen, it uses the distinctive spiky crown shells of Clython corona, a freshwater snail native to the South Pacific region. There's another group of anomurans that I want to briefly mention, and which should serve as a good transition to the rest of the episode. These are the king crabs. They live all over the world's oceans, but they're most well known in the cooler, deeper water habitats at higher latitudes. Although they're technically descended from hermit crabs, the king crabs do not use foreign shells for protection. They don't really even look like other hermit crabs. In fact, they actually look like true crabs. They have the crab-like body form. They're just really big and spiky with long limbs. They rely on these spikes to deter predators. All kinds of fish, like pollock and salmon, prey on the king crabs, pecking at them in the hopes of ripping off a limb or an eye stalk to snack on. Several times in the episode so far, I've mentioned the crab-like body form. What is this, and why is it important? Well, you might recall from previous episodes the coracoid facies body form that I have discussed at length. This is the general morphology of the shrimp and the prawns. You have a fused head and thorax protected by a carapace, 5 pairs of limbs on the thorax that point forward and downward, and a curling segmented abdomen with another 5 pairs of stubbier appendages used to swim and to hold onto and protect clutches of eggs. The crab-like body form is a radical transformation of this coracoid facies body form. To start, the abdomen is reduced and curled under the body until it tucks up and latches or fuses onto the belly or the underside of the thorax. In the coracoid body form, the legs come out from this thoracic underbelly region. But in the crab body form, the legs are positioned more laterally, and they protrude not downwards, but out to the side, so they can make more room for the tucked-in abdomen. The carapace itself broadens and flattens out, as does the sternum, which creates a central indentation in the chest cavity, moving organs around and, again, making room for the tucked-in abdomen. And of course, the first pair of limbs has the classic giant arm and claw physiology. This is the crab-like body form. It's pretty squat and low profile. It's relatively fast-moving, especially compared to other crustaceans like lobsters, and it's able to exploit a wide variety of landscapes and natural resources. It should be no surprise, then, that this process of evolving a crab-like body form, a process called carcinization, has happened multiple times independently in several anomuran lineages. As we've discussed, the anomurans do not have a strictly crab-like body form. They're more lobster-like in the sense that their carapace isn't very broad, and they still have an elongated, spiraling abdomen. But several lineages of hermit crab have independently evolved a reduced and tucked in and under abdomen, a flattened, broadened carapace, and a more lateral arrangement of their appendages. King crabs, for example, are descended from hermit crabs, but they've achieved the crab-like body form through convergent evolution, through carcinization. In addition to the king crabs, the porcelain crabs, a species of hairy stone crab, and a couple species of hermit crabs have also undergone carcinization. This whole process is one of nature's enduring mysteries. What is it, specifically, about the crab body form that makes it so popular? In all of these cases of convergent evolution, why are evolutionary forces converging here on this particular body form? Some hypotheses are that these are adaptations to a more terrestrial environment, where a wider thorax and more spread out legs improves movement on land, and where a reduced abdomen helps to reduce drag, literally the resistance of it dragging along the ground. It reduces the number of body parts that are exposed and vulnerable to predators attacking or damaging, and they allow the animal to wedge itself in smaller spaces to avoid predators or to hide or to ambush prey. Another hypothesis comes from a paper from 2017, which analyzed crab physiology and suggested that carcinization is likely a result of the arrangement of internal organs and muscle tissues. Theoretically, if a species has an abdomen that is bulky and clumsy and easy for predators to attack, there's going to be selection pressure for a smaller abdomen. Certain physiological changes like this, like a reduced abdomen, may require changes in organ and muscle arrangement that necessitate other changes, like a broadened carapace that recovers some of that internal volume in the thoracic cavity. This broadening of the carapace will reposition the appendages, giving both legs and tracts of muscle a more lateral orientation, closer to parallel with the top and bottom of the cephalothorax. This also alters the most energy-efficient movement pattern, which is why crabs typically run sideways instead of forward or backward. It's the most efficient and physiologically comfortable way to move quickly for them because of their flattened, laterally oriented bodies and the requisite rearrangement of muscles and legs. As the crab-like body form is being evolved, at a certain point there's a transition from traditional forward movement to this unique sideways movement. At this point, the lineage is basically locked into this carcinization pathway, as energy constraints will prioritize a flattened body that can efficiently crawl at high speeds. It took a rearrangement of the abdomen and the thorax to get to this point, but from here on out, energy efficiency and effective movement speed become the dominant evolutionary pressures crafting this crab-like body form. The authors of that 2017 paper concluded that carcinization may be an inevitable result of a chain reaction of morphological and physiological transformations set off by certain initial mutations or adaptations. This is one of several really interesting hypotheses seeking to explain carcinization, but currently no explanation has been recognized as definitive and conclusive. In any case, the crab-like body form is most exemplified by Brachyura, the true crabs. It is they who possess the truly lateralized leg arrangement, with a flattened disc-like carapace with a groove running down the middle. It's taken us a while to get here, but these are some of the most derived and sophisticated crustaceans in the world. They are incredibly successful, with some 7,000 described species. This is roughly half of all decapods, so they outnumber pretty much everything else that we've talked about in this episode and the last one too. On that note, a lot of what I said about the hermit crabs, specifically about their ecology and feeding behavior, also applies to their sister clade, Brachyura. Just like the hermit crabs, the true crabs can be found on the deep ocean floor, to coral reefs on the continental shelves, to the intertidal zone, and even freshwater and terrestrial biomes. and they're limited to a kind of amphibious lifestyle due to the need to keep their gills wet. The true crabs are mostly omnivores to one degree or another, but some are strictly herbivores or predominantly carnivores. Some species will mount sponges or anemones to their shells, and some crabs even have asymmetrical claws, where one of them, usually the right claw, is much larger than the other. They share many of the same ecological niches as the hermit crabs, and they're exposed to similar selection pressures, like common predators and environmental conditions. With that in mind, it's really not too surprising that so many anomurans have undergone carcinization to more resemble the true crabs. Also, like many other crustaceans, the crabs are born as strange-looking larvae that don't resemble their mature form. Ecologically, newborn crabs are part of the plankton, but after some time and some number of molts, they'll become juveniles. They're not mature yet, but at least they now resemble the mature form. In crabs, this transition from larva to juvenile involves the tucking in of the abdomen and a final descent from a free-swimming lifestyle in the water column to a life spent crawling on the ground, either the seafloor, along the intertidal zone and rocky outcroppings of coral reef, or further inland. The juvenile crabs continue to molt and grow until they become adults with a fully hardened exoskeleton and a mature body form. Each molting event is dangerous. It's a risky and energy-expensive process that the crab must perform, or else its growth will be stunted and it'll die. If it gets stuck or it can't complete the molt, it'll die. The process takes hours, and if a predator finds it, it's pretty defenseless, so if that predator is hungry and decides to attack the crab, it's going to die. After the molt, its new exoskeleton is really soft. The crab is particularly vulnerable to injury, so it hides for hours to days until everything has set in and the exoskeleton has hardened, and it feels confident enough to go out and about without dying. In day-to-day life, crabs typically seek out fields of algae, which are a primary food source. This is why so many crabs live in the intertidal zone, among algae-covered rocks, or in seagrass meadows, kelp forests, or reef communities, where algae are all very abundant. But, like other decapods, the crabs are generally omnivorous, usually by scavenging. So not only will they scrape up and eat algae, that's like the core of their diet, but they'll also pick at the rotting remains of marine plants, so plant detritus. They'll pick at the fraying bodies of fish and snails and other crustaceans, so animal detritus. And they'll happily plow into a slimy bacterial mat. Mini crabs will also engage in active predation, using one claw to grab and hold prey, and the other to rip at their appendages, to tear out chunks of meat in a mad scramble to maim, crush, and kill them so that they can be safely consumed. The striped shore crab, Pachygrapsis crassipes, for example, is technically an omnivore, but it prefers to hunt as an ambush predator. In other words, it'll eat algae and seaweed if it needs to, if that's all that's available, especially if it's living in more vegetable-laden tide pool habitats, but it prefers to hunt protein-rich prey like mussels and limpets, worms, isopods, slugs and snails, various juicy aquatic insects and their eggs, and smaller crustaceans. The rougher and rockier the habitat of a striped shore crab, the more it prefers carnivory and predation to fill its belly. In comparison, the closely related Pachygrapsis marmoratus is a more generalist omnivore that eats a roughly equal amount of plant and animal biomass no matter which habitat it lives in. It usually preys on immobile shelled animals, like limpets, mussels, and barnacles, whose shells can be cracked open or crushed to reveal the soft flesh inside. The soft flesh of the bivalves, or barnacles, can be scraped out with a claw, or slurped out with specialized mouth parts. In one particularly fascinating case, a giant purple rock crab, Leptograpsis variegatus, was observed eating a Rakawa gecko, a common gecko native to New Zealand. Normally, this species is an omnivore whose animal prey is nothing bigger or more dangerous than a limpet or a barnacle. But this individual crab was seen nestled in a horizontal cleft between two rocks, with the maimed and ruined corpse of the gecko lying in the grip of its claws. The crab sat there quietly as it was being watched, chewing and munching its way through the scale-covered vertebrate with a cool casualness. The aggressive and sometimes violent nature of a crab manifests in other aspects of its life. Many species are competitive and aggressive with each other, such that they frequently fight over territory, like prime feeding areas, or some good shelter in a crevice or a cove or a reef habitat. Males will often fight each other, sometimes to the death, for access to a female. Large communities of crabs will often see mass fights break out. They constantly pinch and pull at each other, and this can easily escalate into death matches that lead to torn-out legs, squished eyeballs, and exoskeletal segments in the arms and face getting crushed. For example, the tube pea crab, Penixa chitotirana, and the eastern tube crab, Polyonyx gibbosii, both inhabit the same ecological niche. They both like to live in the holes and burrows created by polychelate worms. These tunnels are nice little shelters, and when a tube pea crab and an eastern tube crab both try to colonize the same tunnel, they'll fight each other for it. They'll viciously pinch at each other and try and rip each other apart limb by limb until one of them dies or is otherwise so maimed that it can't continue to fight or even move itself into a tunnel. Even more visually spectacular are the battles between fiddler crabs. The male fiddler crabs possess a distinctive feature. One of their claws, usually the right claw, is grossly enlarged. Depending on the species of fiddler crab, the overdeveloped claw can be almost as large as the cephalothorax itself. This massive claw is used to fight off other males for territory and access to mates. It's also used to attract mates. The male will swing his big claw around as fast as possible, and the bright colors and the flashy movement will catch the attention of females. Female fiddler crabs generally prefer males with larger claws, as those males tend to be stronger and more effective signalers. This has created a sexual selection pressure for a larger and larger claw in the males. Curiously, this selection pressure seems to negatively affect the males, as their claws can grow so large that they're cumbersome and unwieldy. They're easy for predators to grab onto, and they're difficult to hide or conceal. A larger claw is also heavier, and waving it around is more energy expensive. This means that the sexual selection pressure is leading to a Fisherian runaway effect, as the overdeveloped claw leads to mating success despite massive inconveniences throughout life. This is somewhat tempered by predation and fighting with other males, which both provide a selection pressure in the other direction for males with a smaller, more practical claw. Naturally, many crabs are also pretty reclusive. They enjoy the protection and the privacy of some sheltered corner of the seabed or along the coastline. They'll hide under rocks, they'll linger in the shadows of a coral reef, or sometimes take shelter between or in the coral itself. And they'll make small tunneling burrows in the sand. Some crabs get really creative when searching for shelter. The Metopograpsus genus includes many species that don't burrow, but instead hide in the murky water and root mazes of mangrove forests. Some of them, like the Metopograpsus mesor, can even climb trees to either avoid predators like fish lurking in the water or terrestrial predators that might prowl around the coastline. A few other interesting examples include the Voltocynus anfractus, which lives on driftwood in the South Pacific. The scaly rock crab, Plagusia squamosa, is known to cling on to larger marine animals, like sea turtles, as they swim around. The trapeziidae coral crabs live in and near anemones as a form of local protection. And the Pinnotheridae family includes many species of very small, soft-bodied crabs which are frequently seen living inside the gills in the mantle tissues of bivalves. These unique habitats and lifestyles are an example of the biodiversity of these crabs and their evolutionary ingenuity. With respect to the Pinnotheridae that live in the gills and mantles of bivalves, this is usually a harmful parasitic relationship, where the tiny oyster crabs and pea crabs eat a portion of the food that the bivalve filtered for itself. In addition to this theft of food, the crabs can also cause mechanical damage to the fragile tissue of the bivalve's gills, perhaps by negligently shredding them with their spiny legs and feet while crawling around. This is often extremely deleterious, stunting the growth and the health of their host, to the point that their fitness is basically ruined, and they remain alive only as a living shelter for the crab. The Caliptraeotheres garthi takes this to an extreme. They inhabit the brood pouch of their host, the limpet Crepidula cacamyla, and effectively castrate it, preventing it from mating. It's also not known for sure if this is because they take so much of their host's food or if they physically block the genitals. But in any case, the effect isn't permanent. When this crab parasite is removed, the host can mate again like normal. This is a very curious ecological relationship. Crab parasitism may harm the limpet population's sustainability. Lower limpet numbers means a decrease in food supply for larger animals that feed on limpets, like otters and various seabirds. The ecological consequences of this parasitic relationship can be felt at all levels of the local habitat. Other imaginative shelter techniques involve living camouflage. The small sponge crabs of the primitive Dromaeidae family, for example, are known to rip off pieces of sponge and mount them on their carapace. The sponge will regenerate, so that little piece that it glued onto itself will regrow. It'll grow larger and provide a mobile piece of shelter for the crab. In addition to sponges, they've also been observed using anemones with their stinging tentacles, urchins with their sharp spines, various tunicates, and even vegetable detritus like clumps of seaweed as shelter that both camouflages and protects them. Sometimes the chosen material, be it algae or anemones or what have you, is cemented or mounted directly onto the exoskeleton. Alternatively, the sponge is held up by one of the rear pairs of legs. The thin, harvestman-like Latrellidae crabs, for example, are known to carry small bits of sponge or tunicate for camouflage to blend into the coral reefs around them. The Homolidae carrier crabs take a more active defense. They too will collect a sponge or a tunicate or an anemone or something and hold it up over their carapace with their rear legs. But instead of using it just as camouflage, they use it like a shield to actively block and parry attacks from predators. In the species that use their rear pair of legs to hold up the sponge or anemone, these rear legs have been evolutionarily altered. They're oriented differently and shaped slightly differently, exhibiting adaptations to optimize this shelter-carrying function. In the seaweed beds and kelp forests along the eastern borders of the Atlantic, from Scandinavia to the tip of Africa and the Mediterranean Sea in between, there's a species of crab that has integrated the camouflage technique into their hunting strategy. These are the long-legged crabs Macropodia rostrata, which have a yellow-gray triangular body with a pair of rather modest claws and 4 pairs of extremely long, thin legs. The Macropodia rostrata will find mats of algae and shreds of seaweed and attach them to their legs. They'll wrap the seaweed around their legs. In the kelp forests, this makes their legs look kind of like the stems of the kelp plants, and if the crab stays very still, Nearby fish may be fooled by the camouflage. They may be lulled into a false sense of security. They may approach the crab's legs thinking that it's just a stem of kelp, and they might nip around it, trying to bite some of the plant. Or they might be looking for a small fish or a parasite or something that lives on or near the plant. Just a little snack that they can check out. And of course, it's just a kelp plant, so what is there to be afraid of, right? The Macropodia rostrata waits until the fish are lulled into this false sense of security and they're checking them out for food. And then they'll strike out and ambush the fish, akin to a crocodile laying still to imitate a floating log, so it can attack wildebeest or zebra drinking at the river. This same camouflage method is also used to hide from predatory fish or cephalopods that may want to eat the crab. Now, when crabs aren't seeking shelter, when they're not hunting or scavenging for food, and when they're not fighting each other, they might be trying to attract a mate. This is a pretty involved process that begins with the female crab releasing pheromones into the water. The pheromones are produced by glands and released into the vascular system, dissolved into the urine and then excreted. The pheromones are then spread into the water, where they stimulate nearby males, encouraging them to follow the concentration gradient to find the female and show her various mating displays. We already talked about the fiddler crabs waving their overdeveloped claw around, and how this may be a part of a Fisherian runaway effect driven by female sexual selection pressure. But other mating techniques include stridulation, or drumming or clicking sounds made with the claws. Male crabs will often combine various body movements with vibrations or sounds to earn the approval of a female. Beyond this initial point in the process, crab mating behavior begins to vary considerably. In some species, the male will hang out and accompany the female for a good chunk of time until she molts. Shedding the older, crustier shell reveals a newer, softer shell underneath. The female will then mate immediately, while her shell is still soft and pliable. After mating, the male will continue to hang around the female for some time until eventually parting ways. In other species, the female will still molt before intercourse, but she'll wait several hours until the new shell has fully hardened beforehand. In these crabs, the act of mating is relatively brief, whereas the more social, longer lingering crabs also have longer periods of coitus. The copulation pose is typically face-to-face and belly-to-belly, with the male using a modified pleopod, or abdominal appendage, as a penis. Remember that in crabs, the abdomen is somewhat deflated and flattened and tucked in and under the body, so it's right there along the belly. So the modified pleopod penis will slip out of the little fold between the abdomen and the belly and find the female's genital pore. Sperm is then deposited inside the receptacle organs of the female, but she may not be fertilized immediately. The female can tap her sperm receptacle organs weeks or even months later to fertilize her eggs. In this way, the female exercises a lot of control over the timing of her reproduction. Eventually, whenever the eggs are fertilized, they'll be released into the cleft between the thorax and the folded under abdomen. This clutch of eggs resembles a mass of small berries bulging out of the cleft between abdomen and thorax. In a few days or weeks, depending on the species, the eggs will hatch into larvae. And like I mentioned earlier, the larvae initially don't look anything like their mature form, but they slowly begin to resemble the mature form over dozens of molting events. I've discussed this larval development before, as it's a really neat process seen among the crustaceans. There's really just a ton of neat stuff about the crustaceans in general, and I think we covered a lot of it here. But as it stands, I think we've come to the end of our journey. We looked at the primitive mud-dwelling cousins to the crabs. We looked at their sister group in the anomuran hermit crabs. And then we looked at the brachyurans themselves and all their wild and 10-legged, clawed glory. This is the end of our mini-series on the Malacostracans. But it's not the end of our greater series on the crustaceans. There's still a few more groups we need to get to, and then of course we'll wrap up with an episode on the historical relationship between humans and crustaceans. If you enjoyed this episode, then hit the like button or give it a 5-star review. If you want more biology content, then hit the subscribe button so you can get new episodes right when I post them. If you want to support the show financially, become a Patreon supporter or check out the official store. Anything you do to show support for the podcast is greatly appreciated. It means so much to me. And as always, thank you for listening.